A single mother took her 2 children to an interview at a millionaire's hotel. When she entered the interview, no one noticed. The 2 children met a strange man, and then, "You brought your children to an interview?" The words, spoken with polite disapproval, carried an edge sharp enough to cut through the sterile air of the conference room. Melissa Stanley shifted in her chair, keeping her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had expected this. "Yes," she said, measured but firm. It was an unavoidable situation. Across from her, the hiring manager, a woman in her 50s with a tight chignon and sharper eyes, exchanged a glance with the man beside her. He wore a charcoal grey suit, his expression unreadable as he drummed his fingers lightly on the polished table. "Our employees are expected to maintain complete focus during their shifts," the woman continued. "You understand why we have concerns?" Melissa swallowed the urge to apologize. She had rehearsed this, how she would hold her ground, how she would not let them make her feel small. But under the fluorescent lighting and their watchful scrutiny, it was difficult not to feel like an anomaly. "I do," she replied. "I've always made arrangements for my children. Today was an exception." The man hummed as he skimmed through her resume. "You've had employment gaps," he noted, "and you're applying for a position that requires flexibility. Early mornings, late nights. If something comes up with your children, will you be able to meet our demands?" Melissa's back stiffened. "I can," she said. "I wouldn't be here if I couldn't." A pause. The air felt dense, charged with something unspoken. Outside, in the waiting area, Mark swung his legs under the chair, his sneakers barely skimming the carpet. He and Amy had been sitting quietly for nearly half an hour, but now Amy squirmed beside him, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "Mark," she whispered, "I need to go." Mark glanced at the closed door where their mother had disappeared. He didn't want to bother her, but Amy's face was scrunched with urgency. "Come on," he murmured, slipping off his chair. "Let's find a bathroom." They wandered through the vast lobby, past towering floral arrangements and the clinking of polished heels on marble floors. Mark held Amy's hand tightly, his eyes scanning for signs. Then, they almost ran into a tall man in a navy suit. Kenneth Foster barely noticed them at first, his attention on his phone, until something brushed his shoe. A dull thud followed. His wallet. Mark bent down, picking up the expensive leather piece before Kenneth had even registered it had fallen. The boy weighed it in his small hands, eyes slightly wide. "This thing's heavy," he remarked, tipping his head back to look at the stranger. "You should sew it to your pants." Kenneth blinked. He had spent the morning in back-to-back meetings, his mind preoccupied with spreadsheets and hotel projections. He was not expecting to be addressed so directly by a child. He took the wallet, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Is that so?" Amy, peeking from behind her brother, gasped softly. "You look like a prince," she blurted. Kenneth's smirk faltered into something closer to amusement. "A prince?" She nodded solemnly. "Mom reads us stories about them." Kenneth crouched slightly, studying the 2 children. They were dressed neatly, though their clothes were slightly worn, and neither looked like they belonged to the usual clientele of the Foster Hotel. His gaze flickered back toward the conference rooms before returning to them. "What are you 2 doing here?" he asked. "Waiting for our mom," Mark said. "She's inside talking to the work people." Kenneth's amusement faded. He glanced at the conference room door, where he knew HR was holding interviews for new staff. His fingers tapped once against his wallet before slipping it back into his pocket. Amy tugged on Mark's sleeve. "Bathroom," she reminded him. "Oh, right," Mark said. He gave Kenneth a quick nod, like a man closing a deal, before pulling Amy toward the hallway. "See ya." Mr. Prince Kenneth watched them go, something unfamiliar settling in his chest. Inside the conference room, Melissa could feel the conclusion forming in the air before they even spoke it. "Thank you for your time," the woman finally said, offering a cool smile. "We'll be in touch." Melissa nodded, masking her disappointment as she stood. She walked out with practiced calm, her heartbeat hammering against her ribs. She had been through this before, the vague rejections, the polite dismissals. Still, this one stung more than she had anticipated. The lobby of Foster Hotel was a world of quiet grandeur, muted conversations, polished marble floors reflecting the soft glow of chandeliers and a faint trace of white lilies perfuming the air. Employees moved with the effortless grace of those who belonged, their pressed uniforms impeccable, their faces a mask of composure. Melissa Stanley did not belong here. She knew it the moment she stepped inside, her worn-out heels clicking too loudly against the pristine tiles. In the lobby, she spotted Mark and Amy instantly. They ran to her, Mark holding her hand while Amy clung to her side. "How did it go?" Mark asked. Melissa forced a smile. It went fine. She wouldn't let them see the doubt gnawing at her. Kenneth stood near the elevator, watching as she led the twins out of the hotel, her shoulders squared but slightly weighed down. He didn't know why he kept looking, but for some reason he did. The late afternoon air was crisp, the sky stretching in a muted shade of grey as Melissa walked along the cracked pavement, Mark and Amy's hands nestled in hers. The rhythm of their footsteps filled the quiet between them, a steady cadence that should have been comforting. It wasn't. She kept her gaze ahead, trying not to let the weight in her chest settle too deeply. The interview hadn't gone well. She had known it before she'd even walked out of that sterile conference room, before she had seen the fleeting glances between the hiring managers, before she had heard the carefully measured words, "We'll be in touch." It was always the same. Amy kicked a stray pebble, watching as it bounced along the pavement. "Mummy, what's for dinner?" she asked, her voice small. Melissa exhaled. "We'll see what we have at home, sweetheart." Beside her, Mark tightened his grip on her fingers. He had been uncharacteristically quiet, thoughtful in a way that reminded her too much of his father. The way he observed, the way he calculated his words before speaking. Finally, he tilted his head up at her. "Mom," he said, "why don't they want you to work because of us?" The question hit harder than it should have. Melissa's steps faltered for half a beat before she forced herself to keep moving, keep breathing. "It's not that they don't want me," she replied carefully, adjusting the strap of her worn-out purse on her shoulder. "Some jobs just worry that having kids makes it harder to focus." Mark frowned. "But you always do everything for us, and do all your work. You never forget anything." Amy nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, you always wake us up and make breakfast and get us to Sarah's and clean and you always know where my socks are even when I don't," Mark finished. Melissa let out a soft, breathy laugh, pressing a kiss to the top of his head. "Thank you, buddy." The innocence of their words, their unwavering belief in her, made the rejection feel sharper. She squeezed their hands, holding onto the warmth of their small fingers. "It's complicated," she said after a moment, "but it's not your fault." Mark didn't seem convinced, but he didn't push. The walk home was longer than it should have been, their little apartment tucked in a neighborhood that still carried the remnants of a livelier past. The buildings, once vibrant, had faded with time, their paint chipping, their windows dull with dust. When they reached the front door, Melissa hesitated just for a moment before forcing herself to unlock it. Inside, she set their backpacks down, slipped off her shoes, and moved toward the kitchen. The fridge hummed softly when she opened it, the light flickering slightly. Sparse shelves stared back at her. She ran her fingers over a carton of eggs, mentally calculating how to stretch a few meals. She would figure it out. She always did. Kenneth leaned back in his chair, the city skyline sprawling out behind him through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The hotel ran like a machine, a finely tuned symphony of staff, service, and luxury, one he had spent years perfecting. He should have been reviewing the latest revenue reports, but his eyes flickered instead to the applicant file still open on his desk. Melissa Stanley. He wasn't sure why he had asked HR to pull it again. Maybe it was the way she had held herself in that room, composed despite the judgment, despite the skepticism. Maybe it was the way her children had carried that same quiet resilience. The little girl who had looked up at him and seen a prince. The boy who had returned his wallet with a remark too sharp for a 5-year-old. Or maybe it was something simpler. Something about the way she had walked out of the hotel with squared shoulders, even when she had clearly expected nothing from them. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. The HR director stepped inside, a neatly organized folder in hand. "We finalized our selections," she said, placing it on his desk. "I know you asked to review the applications one last time, but Melissa Stanley is on the rejection list. She has 2 young children and gaps in her employment. She's not an ideal candidate for a position that demands full availability." Kenneth didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tapped his fingers lightly against the polished wood of his desk, his gaze lingering on her name. Then, after a beat, he leaned forward, flipping the folder open. "Move her to the accepted list," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The director hesitated. "Mr. Foster." "She's qualified," he said simply, "and she handled that interview better than most." A pause. Then reluctantly, the director nodded. "Understood." As she left the office, Kenneth closed the file and leaned back once more, exhaling slowly. He wasn't sure why he had done it, but he supposed he'd find out soon enough. Melissa was elbow-deep in dishwater when the phone rang. The shrill sound startled her, her wet hands fumbling for the towel before she snatched the receiver. "Hello? Miss Stanley?" She didn't recognize the voice. "Yes? This is Foster Hotel's Human Resources Department. We'd like to formally offer you the housekeeping position." Melissa blinked. For a moment, the words didn't make sense. The rejection, the polite dismissal. Hadn't she already lost this job? "We'll send over the details regarding training and onboarding," the voice continued. "Can you start next Monday?" Her mind caught up slowly, the weight in her chest lifting. Just a fraction, just enough for her to find her voice. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, I can." When she hung up, she turned, only to find Mark and Amy watching her with wide eyes. "You got it?" Mark asked. Melissa stared at them for a second before nodding, a slow, growing smile breaking across her lips. "I got it." Amy cheered. Mark grinned. For the first time in weeks, hope settled into the corners of their little apartment, quiet but steady. The morning air was crisp, the kind that hinted at autumn's slow arrival, and the streets hummed with the rhythm of a city shaking off the last remnants of dawn. Melissa pulled her coat tighter around herself as she stepped off the bus, exhaling slowly as she looked up at the towering glass facade of Foster Hotel. The grandeur of the building wasn't lost on her. Even now, standing at the entrance in her neatly pressed uniform, she felt like an outsider slipping through the cracks of a world she didn't belong to. But she had earned this, and she wouldn't let the feeling swallow her. The lobby was already buzzing with early morning guests, business travelers in crisp suits, couples lingering over coffee in the lounge, bellboys maneuvering polished luggage carts with quiet efficiency. She adjusted the strap of her housekeeping bag, squared her shoulders, and stepped inside. The housekeeping department was tucked behind a set of service elevators, a stark contrast to the lavish front of the hotel. Here, the floors were scuffed from years of hurried footsteps, and the air smelled of freshly laundered linens and industrial-grade cleaning supplies. A group of housekeepers had already gathered for morning assignments. Melissa hovered near the edge, feeling the weight of unspoken curiosity pressing against her. "She's the one," a voice murmured. Melissa didn't need to turn to know they were talking about her. "Got the job out of nowhere," another whispered. She forced herself to focus on the supervisor standing at the front, a clipboard in hand. The woman's name tag read, "Teresa, head housekeeper." Her voice was brisk, no nonsense, as she listed off room assignments, barely sparing Melissa a glance. "New girl, You're covering the East Wing. 10 rooms by noon. Don't fall behind." Melissa nodded, gripping her cart as she followed the others out. Her first few rooms were a test of endurance. The hotel's standards were high. Sheets had to be pulled tight enough to pass the coin test, toiletries arranged in exact symmetry, glass surfaces wiped down until they gleamed. Every movement had to be efficient, practiced. By the time she reached the 4th room, her arms ached, and a thin layer of sweat clung to her back, despite the cool air conditioning. She was adjusting a duvet cover when the voice of an irritated guest cut through the quiet. "This is unacceptable." Melissa's head snapped up. A middle-aged man in a tailored navy suit stood near the doorway, holding up a towel with a barely noticeable frayed edge. His expression was tight with disapproval, his gaze sweeping over the room as though the imperfection had ruined his entire stay. "I can't believe a hotel of this caliber allows something like this," he huffed, tossing the towel onto the bed. Melissa forced a steady breath, pushing down the instinctive flash of defensiveness. "I apologize for the oversight, sir," she said smoothly, stepping forward. "Allow me to replace that immediately." She moved quickly, retrieving a fresh towel from the supply cart. But as she placed it down, she hesitated, just enough to grab a complimentary scented linen spray from the amenities basket. A small touch, but one she knew guests appreciated. "This is one of our finest imported scents," she added, lightly misting the fresh towels. "A signature touch we offer to our guests for added comfort." The man paused, nostrils flaring slightly, as the delicate scent of white tea and jasmine filled the air. His expression shifted, just barely. Melissa didn't need a thank you. She could see the tension in his posture ease, the irritation settling into quiet acceptance. He wouldn't be complaining to management. As he turned away, she caught a glimpse of someone watching from the hallway. Kenneth Foster. He wasn't close enough to have heard the exchange, but he had seen enough. His arms were crossed loosely over his chest, his expression unreadable as he observed her work. Melissa didn't react. She had a job to finish. She picked up her cleaning cloth, wiped down the bedside table with the same quiet precision, and moved on to the next room. By noon, her body ached, but she had kept up. As she wheeled her cart back toward the service hallway, she overheard 2 senior housekeepers murmuring nearby. She handled the executive suite without a hitch. Yeah, maybe she'll last longer than the last one. Melissa pretended not to hear. She wouldn't celebrate yet. It was only the first day, but as she glanced out the tall glass windows in the hallway, the city stretching out beyond the pristine hotel grounds, she allowed herself a small breath of relief. She was still here. That was a start. The city settled into a familiar rhythm as autumn crept closer, the air sharper in the mornings, the sky brushed in muted shades of gold by late afternoon. Melissa had begun to fall into her own rhythm, one measured by the quiet hum of the housekeeping corridors, the distant chime of elevator doors opening, the weight of freshly folded linens stacked on her cart. It was no longer just about keeping up. She had learned the fastest way to strip a bed, how to tuck in the sheets so perfectly that even the pickiest guests wouldn't find fault. She knew which rooms were easiest, which ones left behind a mess of empty wine bottles and discarded clothes, and which ones, like the penthouse suites, held an air of untouched perfection, as though their occupants had been too busy to truly live in them. And perhaps most importantly, she had learned how to navigate the silent judgment that had followed her since the first day. It had started with small things. The skeptical glances had slowly shifted into nods of acknowledgement, though no one said much at first. Some of the senior housekeepers still watched her with quiet curiosity, but she was no longer just the new girl who got in too easily. She noticed it the first time Teresa, the head housekeeper, stopped by one of her rooms for an impromptu inspection. Melissa had just finished fluffing the pillows, stepping back to scan for anything out of place, when Teresa entered. The older woman ran a hand along the edge of the desk, checking for dust, then glanced toward the perfectly aligned amenities on the nightstand. No words of praise, no approving nods, but she didn't linger, and that was enough. The next morning, when assignments were handed out, Melissa's name was listed next to a more difficult floor, the one with the executive suites. A quiet test, perhaps, to see if she could handle the responsibility. She had, and by the following week, a quiet shift had taken place. When she entered the break room during lunch, she no longer felt like an outsider trespassing in someone else's space. A cup of coffee appeared beside her one day, left on the table by an anonymous hand. Someone passed her an unopened energy bar when they saw her skipping lunch. It wasn't spoken approval, but it was something. Outside of work, things had begun to settle into their own routine as well. Each morning, after breakfast, Melissa walked Mark and Amy to Sarah's flower shop. The twins had taken to their new arrangement quickly, finding a certain delight in being surrounded by blooms of every color. Amy was drawn to the softer petals, the pastel roses, the delicate sprays of baby's breath, while Mark was fascinated by the mechanics of it all, watching Sarah carefully trim stems and arrange bouquets. "They're good helpers," Sarah had said one afternoon when Melissa came to pick them up, a mischievous smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Though I think Mark is a little too invested in the cash register. He keeps asking if he can reorganize my receipts." Melissa had laughed, exhaustion pressing into her bones, but warmth filling her chest. At least, in this small corner of their world, things felt safe. Unbeknownst to Melissa, she was being observed from a quiet distance. Kenneth had never been one to linger unnecessarily. He ran the hotel like a finely tuned orchestra, each department expected to function without direct intervention. But somehow, in the past week, his path had repeatedly crossed hers. It wasn't intentional. Not really. At first, it was just a passing glance as he reviewed reports in the lobby, watching as she moved through the hallways, efficient and steady, her uniform neat despite the strain of the day. Then it was catching the tail end of an interaction between her and a guest, noting how she handled situations without complaint, without letting irritation seep into her voice. And then, perhaps most surprisingly, he had overheard the way the other housekeepers spoke of her, not with resentment, not with dismissal, but with a quiet acceptance that she had earned her place. He told himself it was simply professional curiosity, that it was only natural to keep an eye on employees who proved to be more than what was expected. But Kenneth wasn't the kind of man to lie to himself. Not when he still remembered the sharp wit of her son returning his wallet. Not when he recalled the way her daughter had called him a prince. And certainly not when he caught the glimpse of exhaustion in Melissa's eyes, the kind that spoke of someone who had carried the weight of too much for too long, but had never let it crush her. For now, he said nothing, but he watched, and he waited. The Foster Hotel gleamed against the night sky, its towering structure standing firm against the hum of the city below. Inside, the soft murmur of conversations drifted through the lobby, interwoven with the polished efficiency of bellboys and receptionists. Everything was running as smoothly as expected, except for one mistake. A small, seemingly insignificant oversight. For Melissa, the night was a rare luxury. The evening air carried a quiet stillness as Melissa stepped into the grand lobby of Foster Hotel, not as a housekeeper, but as a guest. The marble floors gleamed under the warm glow of chandeliers, and for the first time, she wasn't passing through unnoticed with a cleaning cart. A crisp, gold-embossed envelope rested in her hands, her name written elegantly on the front. Her reward for winning Employee of the Quarter. A night in one of the hotel's luxury suites, complete with 5-star amenities and a break from the world she had been tirelessly keeping in order. The front desk staff greeted her warmly, though some looked surprised. Housekeepers didn't usually get this kind of recognition. "Ms. Stanley, here's your key," the receptionist said with a polite smile, sliding the sleek black card across the counter. Melissa took it carefully, half expecting it to disappear, as if someone would realize they had made a mistake. but no one did. She was allowed this. For once, she was not cleaning up after luxury. She was living in it. The evening air carried a quiet stillness as Melissa stepped into the grand lobby of Foster Hotel, not as a housekeeper, but as a guest. The marble floors gleamed under the warm glow of chandeliers, and for the first time, she wasn't passing through unnoticed with a cleaning cart. A crisp, gold-embossed envelope rested in her hands, her name written elegantly on the front, her reward for winning Employee of the Quarter. A night in one of the hotel's luxury suites, complete with 5-star amenities and a break from the world she had been tirelessly keeping in order. The front desk staff greeted her warmly, though some looked surprised. Housekeepers didn't usually get this kind of recognition. "Ms. Stanley, here's your key," the receptionist said, with a polite smile, sliding the sleek black card across the counter. Melissa took it carefully, half expecting it to disappear, as if someone would realize they had made a mistake. But no one did. She was allowed this. For once, she was not cleaning up after luxury. She was living in it. After dropping Mark and Amy off at Sarah's, she had stepped into the suite with a quiet, almost hesitant breath, as if afraid that someone might realize she didn't belong and take it away. But no one did, so she let herself sink into the deep bath, the warm water, a foreign but welcome embrace against her aching muscles. For Kenneth, the night was one of exhaustion. An unexpected crisis in the hotel's international branch had required back-to-back meetings, his entire day swallowed in negotiations, troubleshooting, and corporate damage control. By the time he arrived at the hotel, his own hotel, his patience had worn thin. He wanted nothing more than to collapse in his room, loosen his tie, and silence the world for a few hours. The front desk receptionist, flustered under the weight of a long shift and a queue of impatient guests, had handed him a keycard without a second thought. The wrong keycard. The door clicked open just as Melissa stepped out of the bathroom, her hair damp, a hotel robe loosely tied around her waist. She barely had time to register the sound before the heavy thud of footsteps filled the space. A man. Her heart lurched in panic. Kenneth, moving on autopilot, hadn't looked up yet, his mind still tangled in business reports and time zone calculations. His hand went to his tie, loosening it as he moved deeper into the suite, the familiarity of the space keeping him from questioning anything. It wasn't until Melissa gasped, stepping back too quickly on the slick floor, that his eyes snapped up, their gazes locked. And then, chaos. Melissa slipped, her foot skidding against the smooth tile, her balance lost in a heartbeat. Her hand reached out for support, but instead she collided with the small glass table beside her, sending the half-filled wine glass dump on the floor. The red liquid spread in a slow, sinister stain, pooling around her as she landed with a breathless, startled cry. Kenneth's exhausted mind registered only one thing: blood. Perhaps his intelligence and clarity were gone after that damn meeting. His stomach twisted. His heart jumped to his throat. Without a second thought, he was rushing forward, already pulling his phone from his pocket. "Hold on," he muttered, his thumb pressing the emergency call button. Melissa, dazed and mortified, forced her eyes shut as she processed what just happened. The robe was barely clinging to her frame, the bath had left her warm and flushed, and now she was sprawled out on the floor in front of Kenneth. If she woke up now, who knows what would happen? She was really only wearing a bathrobe, and inside, empty. Too embarrassing for a woman. Kenneth Foster, her boss. Her brain caught up at the same moment he started barking instructions into the phone. "I need medical assistance in suite 1904 now." Her eyes aimed tight. "What?" she thought. Kenneth, already kneeling beside her, his face taut with urgency, barely registered that she had spoken. "Stay still," he instructed, his voice clipped, controlled, the way people sound when they're holding back panic. Melissa followed his gaze and realized what he saw, The deep red liquid splattered across the pristine white of the hotel floor, streaking across her arms, her legs. Leave a comment, peach tea, if you find this story interesting. The wailing siren of the ambulance cut through the night, a jarring contrast to the quiet elegance of Foster Hotel's upper floors. Melissa sat stiffly in the back, her hands clenched in her lap, her bare legs barely covered by a hotel blanket one of the paramedics had handed her. Her entire body burned with mortification. Kenneth sat across from her, his suit slightly wrinkled from the rushed events of the past half hour. His jaw was tight, his arms crossed as he watched the city blur past the windows. He had barely spoken since the paramedics arrived. Melissa, on the other hand, had said absolutely nothing. It wasn't just the humiliation of being half naked in front of her boss, though that was bad enough. It was the sheer absurdity of it all. The spilled wine, the panicked emergency call. The fact that Kenneth had looked at her and immediately assumed she was bleeding out on his hotel floor. She should have spoken up earlier. She should have stopped him before it escalated. But no, here she was, wrapped in a blanket, speeding toward a hospital for absolutely no reason. Melissa pressed her eyes shut, willing herself to disappear. Maybe if she stayed quiet enough, the universe would erase this moment from time itself. When the ambulance finally pulled into the hospital, Melissa made a split-second decision. The moment the doors opened and the paramedics turned their attention elsewhere, she slipped past them, moving with the kind of silent efficiency she had mastered from years of working in the background. She ducked into a side hallway, heart pounding, her bare feet cool against the polished floors. Okay, she whispered to herself. Think. The hospital was busy enough that no one stopped her, and within minutes she had slipped out the side entrance, her body still buzzing with adrenaline. The only thing worse than being taken to the hospital for no reason. Having to sit through a lecture from an actual doctor about why she needed to be more careful. Nope, not happening. Back at the hotel, Kenneth had just stepped out of the elevator when a flustered front desk attendant rushed toward him. Mr. Foster, sir, there was a mistake with your suite assignment. Kenneth, still drained from the entire ordeal, simply exhaled. Clearly. The receptionist fidgeted. We assigned you to the same room as Ms. Stanley due to a system error, and the incident in the suite was, just a spilled wine glass. Kenneth stared at them. The words settled slowly. Then finally, his brain clicked into place. The red liquid, the panic, the ridiculous amount of effort he had spent trying to save her. It was wine, not blood, not an accident. Wine. Kenneth closed his eyes briefly. Then, to the receptionist's absolute terror, he let out a short, incredulous laugh. Because, honestly, it was funny. Utterly, stupidly funny. Kenneth shook his head. Understood. I'll handle it. The receptionist looked relieved. Kenneth, on the other hand, was already plotting how he was going to deal with Melissa Stanley the next morning. Melissa could barely focus on her work. She had somehow made it home last night, after sneaking through the back entrance of her apartment building like some kind of fugitive, and had successfully avoided thinking about Kenneth Foster for approximately 6 hours. Then, she had walked into the staff area, and the second she set foot in the break room, she knew, the moment she entered, conversations halted. A couple of housekeepers glanced at her, eyes wide with barely contained amusement. Someone snickered. Oh no. Teresa, the head housekeeper, passed by, throwing her a knowing smirk. Good to have you back, Stanley. Eventful night. Melissa wanted to die. She schooled her face into something neutral and marched toward her cart. She could ignore this. She could pretend. Ah, there she is. Her stomach dropped. The deep, amused voice came from behind her. Melissa turned slowly, already dreading what she would see. And there he was, Kenneth Foster, looking far too composed, far too entertained, and absolutely ready to ruin her life. He leaned casually against the doorframe, arms crossed, a smirk pulling at the corner of his lips. Melissa Stanley, he said, voice light with obvious amusement. Our very own dramatic fainting actress. Melissa groaned out loud. Kenneth, to her absolute horror, did not stop there. "Oh, don't look so miserable," he continued, clearly enjoying himself. "I'm just glad to see you survived your near-fatal encounter with a glass of wine." Melissa willed herself to stay professional. "I slipped," she said, voice clipped. "That's all." Kenneth tilted his head, pretending to consider. From where I stood, it looked much more dramatic. There was screaming, a whole medical response team. Melissa rubbed a hand down her face. "I was not screaming." Kenneth chuckled. "Debatable." Melissa shot him a flat look, but Kenneth didn't move. If anything, he seemed more amused. "You do realize," he added, voice far too relaxed, "that this is going to be an ongoing topic of conversation for a while." Melissa gritted her teeth. "Sir," she said tightly, "I do have work to do." Kenneth grinned, stepping back. "Of course, don't let me stop you." Melissa turned on her heel and stalked off, but not before hearing the quiet laugh he let out behind her. She was never living this down. The hotel carried the same rhythm it always did, a perfectly tuned machine of luxury and efficiency, but something had subtly shifted in Melissa's routine. It started small. The first time she thought it was a mistake. A neatly packed meal had been left in the staff break room, tucked into the usual corner where employees placed their lunch bags. But this one had no name on it, just a simple note written on the container's lid. "Eat, don't skip meals." Melissa had stared at it for a long moment, arms crossed. She hadn't brought anything that day. She'd been in a rush, too preoccupied with making sure Mark and Amy had their lunches before school. A coincidence? Maybe. She didn't touch it. The small gestures continue. Then it happened again. A fresh cup of coffee, still warm, appeared on her housekeeping cart one morning. Melissa frowned, glancing around the hallway. There was no one there. She picked it up, checking for any sign of who had left it. The sleeve was blank, no receipt, no initials scribbled in marker. Just a perfect untouched cup, exactly the way she liked it. No sugar, just a splash of cream. Her first instinct was to look toward the other housekeepers, but the usual suspects were busy tending to rooms, their routines uninterrupted. She wasn't imagining it. And the next day, a pain relief patch sat neatly in her locker, placed exactly where she would notice it. Melissa ran her fingers over the packaging, feeling the cool, smooth plastic beneath her touch. The back pain had been bothering her for days, especially after scrubbing down an entire suite the morning before. No one else knew, except... Her stomach twisted. Kenneth. Melissa wasn't an idiot. There weren't many people in the hotel who would notice things like this, let alone do something about them. And the only person who seemed to take a particular interest in her well-being lately. Kenneth. She knew she should confront him, ask outright if he was behind this. But the idea of acknowledging it, the idea of standing face to face with him while he smirked, that infuriatingly self-satisfied smirk. Nope. Not happening. So, she pretended not to notice. If she didn't acknowledge it, it wasn't real. If she drank the coffee, it had just been a coincidence. If she used the pain relief patch, someone else must have left it there by accident. That was easier than admitting that Kenneth Foster, the CEO, the man who had spent the past week teasing her mercilessly, was doing something kind. Their interactions had changed in the days following the hotel room incident. Kenneth had stopped teasing her as relentlessly, at least not in the way that made her want to throw a towel at his face. The smug amusement had softened into something else. Something quieter. And somehow, without realizing it, she had started talking to him. Not the formal, polite conversations of a housekeeper to a CEO. Real conversations. Like the night she was wiping down the lobby windows, and he had ended up sitting in one of the armchairs, rolling his sleeves up as he went over a hotel report. "You always stay this late?" she had asked, mostly to fill the silence. Kenneth had glanced up, his expression unreadable. "You always work this hard," he countered. Melissa had huffed, shaking her head. "That's not an answer." Kenneth had closed the folder in front of him, leaning back in his chair. "No," he admitted. "But sometimes it feels easier than going home." Something about the way he said it had unsettled her, not in a bad way, but in a way that made her notice things. The tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers curled slightly against the armrest, the way his gaze had flickered, just for a second, like there was something heavier beneath it. So, for the first time, she pushed back. Why? Kenneth had studied her, as if debating whether or not to answer. Then, finally, "Because no one expects you to fail if you don't stop working." Melissa had stilled, and just like that, the distance between them shifted, because she knew that feeling. She knew it all too well. The crushing weight of responsibility, the knowledge that one wrong step could make everything unravel. So, she had answered honestly. "I never expected to do this alone," she had admitted. Raising 2 kids, finding a way to make things work when nothing wanted to. Kenneth had been silent, not in an uncomfortable way, just listening. A different kind of understanding. The more they talked, the more Melissa realized something. Kenneth Foster, the stoic, always in control CEO, was carrying more than people thought. And somehow, against all logic, he understood her too. She still didn't acknowledge the small gestures, the coffee, the meals, the silent ways he looked out for her. But she noticed them, and she noticed him. And that was enough. The grand lobby of Foster Hotel had emptied, the usual rush of guests dwindling as the night stretched on. Most of the employees had already left, the last traces of their presence marked by the faint murmur of a closing shift, winding down. Melissa adjusted the strap of her bag, exhaling as she stepped into the lobby. It had been another long day, but at least she was finally heading home. Beside her, Kenneth walked at a relaxed pace, his tie slightly loosened, the polished exterior of a CEO subtly undone after an exhausting evening of meetings. It had become an odd habit, leaving work at the same time, walking the same path to the exit, falling into step with one another even without meaning to. Tonight was no different. Until she heard the sound of tiny, familiar voices. "Mommy!" Melissa's head snapped up just in time to see 2 small figures barreling toward her, Mark and Amy. She barely had time to register the blur of motion before Amy flung herself at her, arms locking around her waist in a tight embrace. Mark, ever the independent one, stopped just short of colliding, his bright eyes taking in the hotel surroundings. Melissa blinked, startled. "What are you two?" "I brought them," Sarah's voice cut in, amused. She stood just behind them, arms crossed, a knowing smirk playing at her lips. "I figured we'd surprise you." Melissa sighed, but she couldn't be annoyed. "Did you behave?" "We always behave," Mark said casually, already peering around the hotel with interest. "This place is fancy." Kenneth, who had been watching the exchange with mild amusement, finally cleared his throat. And just like that, both twins turned their attention to him. Mark narrowed his eyes slightly, studying him with almost too much focus for a 5-year-old. Amy, however, lit up instantly. "It's the prince," Melissa groaned. Kenneth arched an eyebrow, smirking slightly. "Still a prince, am I?" he asked. Amy nodded enthusiastically. "You look like one." Mark crossed his arms. "I thought princes had swords." Kenneth's lips twitched. "I must have left mine in my office." Mark, unimpressed, let his gaze drift lower. Then his eyes widened slightly, like he'd remembered something important. "Wait a second." Melissa's stomach dropped. Mark pointed directly at Kenneth's suit pocket. "Did you sew your wallet in yet?" Kenneth actually laughed. Melissa, however, was mortified. "You told them about that," she hissed under her breath. Kenneth grinned, looking far too entertained for her liking. I didn't have to. Apparently your son is observant. Mark beamed. I remember everything. Amy nodded, backing him up. He does. Sarah, watching all of this unfold, let out a low chuckle. You know, she mused, tilting her head at Kenneth, I think you should drive them home. Melissa snapped her head towards Sarah. What? Sarah simply shrugged. It's late, and their place is a little far, and I have an early flower delivery tomorrow. You wouldn't want me to drive while half asleep, would you? Melissa narrowed her eyes. You're doing this on purpose, Sarah grinned. Obviously. Kenneth, to Melissa's absolute horror, looked completely unfazed. Not a bad idea, he said smoothly. Melissa turned to him, glaring. You don't have to. I don't mind, he interrupted, voice far too casual. It's on my way. Melissa didn't believe that for a second. Mark, however, pumped his fist. Yes, I get to ride in the fancy car, Amy gasped. Do you have a carriage? Kenneth chuckled. It's not a carriage, but it's comfortable. Melissa sighed heavily, rubbing her temples. She was losing this battle. Sarah, pleased with herself, gave her a small pat on the shoulder before leaning down to the twins. Be good, okay? And don't let your mum get too grumpy. Melissa shot her a deadly look. Sarah just winked and walked off. The interior of Kenneth's car was quiet, save for the soft hum of the engine and the occasional whispered giggle from the twins. Melissa, sitting in the passenger seat, felt strangely out of place. She wasn't used to this, to someone else driving, to having an extra pair of hands helping at the end of the night. She glanced at Kenneth. He looked completely at ease, one hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly on the gear shift, like he belonged here. That was a dangerous thought. Mark, from the back seat, leaned forward slightly. Do you like my mum? He asked bluntly. Melissa nearly choked on air. Kenneth, to his credit, didn't miss a beat. She's very hard-working, he said smoothly. Mark nodded, satisfied. She's also really good at saving money. So if you want to date her, you won't have to buy expensive stuff. Melissa buried her face in her hands. Amy, oblivious to her mother's suffering, gasped. Wait, does this mean he's our new dad? Kenneth actually coughed. Melissa whipped around in her seat. Okay, that's enough from both of you. Mark, still unfazed, shrugged. Just checking. Amy giggled. I think he'd be a nice dad. Melissa let out a long, suffering sigh. Kenneth, strangely enough, didn't look bothered. If anything, he looked almost thoughtful. Halfway through the drive, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah. Sarah, I think your prince likes you. Melissa stared at the screen, pulse stuttering. Sarah, also, maybe you like him too. Just saying. She locked her phone immediately. Absolutely not, right? The rest of the drive passed in relative silence, except for the occasional whisper between the twins. By the time they pulled up in front of their apartment, Melissa was more than ready to escape. She turned to thank Kenneth, but before she could say anything, Mark leaned in close to him. I know you like my mom, he whispered conspiratorially. Kenneth arched an eyebrow. Oh? Mark grinned. Yeah, and she's really good at keeping money safe, so if you like her, you better be ready. Kenneth let out a low chuckle, shaking his head in amusement. I'll keep that in mind. Melissa, still recovering, nudged the twins toward the door. Inside, now. Mark and Amy waved happily before disappearing into the apartment. Melissa turned back to Kenneth, feeling utterly drained. They're a handful, she muttered. Kenneth smirked. They take after their mother. Melissa rolled her eyes. Thanks for the ride. Try not to let them get to your head. Kenneth, still leaning against the car, studied her for a moment. Then, with a small nod, he said, Good night, Melissa. Something in his voice, something quiet, something certain, made her stomach twist. She swallowed, ignoring it. Good night. Then she turned, disappearing inside, before she could let herself think too much about it. The next morning, the Foster Hotel was already alive with movement by the time Melissa arrived. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the pristine marble floors as guests moved through the grand lobby. Melissa moved quickly through the back corridors, keeping her head down as she clocked in for her shift. She had barely slept last night, not because the twins had been difficult, but because her mind refused to stop replaying the car ride home. More specifically, Mark's parting words. "I know you like my mum," Melissa sighed, rubbing her temples. It was ridiculous. Kenneth Foster did not like her. He was her boss, a man who ran a multi-million-dollar hotel empire. They existed in completely different worlds, right? She shook the thought away, grabbing her housekeeping cart. She had work to do. At first, the day seemed normal. Rooms to clean, checklists to complete, linens to replace. But then, things started to feel different. For one, the stairs. Her co-workers had been glancing at her all morning, their expressions ranging from amused to outright curious. When she stepped into the break room for a quick drink of water, she caught two housekeepers whispering. The moment they noticed her, they quickly looked away. Melissa frowned. What the hell was going on? Then there was Kenneth. Normally, he barely interacted with the housekeeping staff. He was always around, overseeing operations, running meetings, handling VIP clients. But he didn't involve himself in the daily routines of hotel maintenance. Except today, he did. Melissa was wiping down a window in the executive lounge when she sensed someone nearby. She turned her head and nearly dropped the cloth in her hand. Kenneth stood just a few feet away, arms crossed, watching her with a strange expression. She straightened immediately. "Sir?" Kenneth's gaze flickered to the window she was cleaning. "Smudged." Melissa blinked. "What?" He gestured vaguely. "The left side? You missed a spot." Melissa stared at him. Was he checking her work? "You never check my work," she pointed out suspiciously. Kenneth smirked. "Maybe I should start." Melissa narrowed her eyes. Something was up. Kenneth Foster did not randomly go around inspecting hotel windows. She let out a slow breath, gripping the cloth tightly. "Is there something you need, Mr. Foster?" Kenneth tilted his head slightly, like he was debating something. Then, with absolutely no warning, he said it. "I had an interesting conversation with your son last night." Melissa froze. "Oh no. No. She slowly turned to face him fully. "And?" Kenneth leaned slightly against the window ledge, looking far too relaxed for her liking. "He seems to think I should take you on a date." Melissa wanted to die. Her face caught fire. What?" Kenneth chuckled. "Very observant kid." Melissa groaned, burying her face in her hands. After the utterly humiliating conversation with Kenneth, Melissa threw herself into work. If she ignored it, it didn't happen. That was her strategy. But ignoring Kenneth was proving to be difficult, because he wasn't acting normal. Normally, they barely exchanged words. But today, he passed her in the hallway and casually greeted her by name. He never did that. He walked into the break room, glanced at the table and said, "You're not skipping lunch again, are you?" "Excuse me?" When she wheeled her cart into the service elevator, he stepped in beside her. Why was he even here? Melissa tried not to overthink it. But then, there were the small gestures, the coffee, the pain relief patches, the little things that had been appearing in her daily routine, before she could ignore it. Now, she wasn't so sure. That evening, Melissa finished her shift later than usual. The corridors were quieter, the rush of guests slowing down as the night settled over the city. She was exhausted. As she stepped into the lobby, ready to leave, she spotted Kenneth. He was standing near the entrance, hands in his pockets, staring out at the busy street beyond the hotel doors. She could have walked past him. She should have. But instead, She stopped. "Aren't you going home?" she asked. Kenneth didn't look at her right away. "Not yet." Melissa hesitated. She could just leave. Or she shifted slightly, glancing toward him. "You work too much." Kenneth let out a quiet chuckle. "And you don't," Melissa huffed. "Touché." A beat of silence stretched between them. Then, before she could second-guess herself, she spoke again. "Mark wasn't wrong, you know." Kenneth finally turned to look at her. "About what?" Melissa forced herself to hold his gaze. "You do act different around me." Kenneth's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air. He studied her for a long moment, then exhaled slowly. "I don't know how to act around you, Melissa." Melissa sucked in a quiet breath. She wasn't sure what she had expected him to say, but it wasn't that. The words settled between them, unspoken but heavy. Melissa's heart pounded. She didn't have a response, didn't know if she even wanted to have one. So instead, she nodded once, and she left. Because for now, that was enough. The meeting room at Foster Hotel's executive floor was silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the far wall. The table was polished to perfection, reflecting the harsh LED lights overhead, while a dozen executives sat in sleek leather chairs, discussing revenue projections and expansion plans. Kenneth sat at the head of the table, his fingers loosely interlocked in front of him, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. The words of the senior managers blurred into a meaningless hum. He was supposed to be reviewing the upcoming investor summit, but his gaze had drifted to the window, where the city stretched beyond the glass in twinkling lights. He wasn't thinking about quarterly reports. He was thinking about Melissa, about how she had looked at him last night, half hesitant, half understanding, about how, despite her avoidance, she had finally acknowledged that something between them was shifting, and about how, for the first time in years, he wanted something for himself. A chair scraped against the floor, jolting him back to reality. "Mr. Foster." The voice of his CFO cut through his thoughts. "Your thoughts on the profit margin adjustments?" Kenneth blinked, clearing his throat. "I'll review the numbers later," he said smoothly. Meeting adjourned. His executives hesitated. Kenneth Foster was never one to cut a meeting short. But the steel in his tone left no room for discussion. He didn't have time for numbers today. He had something more important to do. Melissa had just finished putting away her supplies when she stepped out of the employee wing. The lobby was quiet. Late evening had settled over the city, the grand chandeliers casting a soft golden glow against the marble floors. She had been ready to go home, ready to shake off whatever strange tension had been following her all day. Until she saw Kenneth. He stood near the glass doors, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. But there was an intent in the way he looked at her. Melissa's pulse jumped. She could turn around. She could walk out and pretend she didn't see him, but she didn't. Instead, she walked toward him. Kenneth's gaze didn't waver. "I need to talk to you." Melissa swallowed. "About what?" Kenneth exhaled. "Us." Her chest tightened. There it was. The thing she had been trying to ignore. She forced out a small, uneasy laugh. "What us?" Kenneth didn't smile. He didn't smirk. He just looked at her. "I know I should have figured it out earlier," he said, his voice quieter now, the weight behind it unmistakable. "But He stopped, ran a hand through his hair, a rare moment of uncertainty slipping through his usual control. Melissa had never seen him look like that. Not in meetings, not in the hallways, not ever. "I don't just admire you, Melissa," he continued. "I don't just respect how hard you work, how much you care about your kids, how you never let anything break you. It's more than that." Melissa felt her breath catch. Kenneth stepped closer. "I want to be part of your life." The words hit her like a slow-building storm. Kenneth Foster, CEO, perfectionist, untouchable, was standing in front of her, telling her that he wanted her. Melissa's mind raced. She had spent so long convincing herself that he was out of reach, that whatever strange, quiet moments they had shared, the teasing, the glances, the unspoken understanding, had been nothing more than passing interactions. But now, there was no pretending. Melissa hesitated. She had been through too much. She wasn't sure she could risk opening up again. Kenneth saw the hesitation, and he didn't push. Instead, he just watched her, letting her decide. Melissa closed her eyes for half a second, took a deep breath, and then she exhaled. "I feel the same way," she admitted softly. Kenneth froze, like he hadn't expected her to say it. Like, despite everything, he still thought she would pull away. But she didn't. She met his gaze, steady this time. "I don't know where this goes," she continued. "But I think I want to find out." Kenneth's lips curved into the smallest smile. Melissa wasn't sure if her heart was pounding out of fear or something far more dangerous. But for once, she didn't look away. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and earth, a quiet reminder that the seasons were shifting. In the park, children's laughter echoed between the tall, swaying trees, blending seamlessly with the rustling wind. It was late afternoon, the golden sun casting long shadows across the grass, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Melissa allowed herself to just breathe. Mark and Amy ran ahead, their giggles filling the open space as they chased each other between the towering oaks. A cool breeze swept past, ruffling Melissa's hair as she walked beside Kenneth. It still felt strange. Not bad. Just new. Kenneth had offered to take them to the park. No formal plans, no expectations. Just a day outside, letting the twins run free while they figured out what this new understanding between them meant. Melissa watched as Amy picked up a handful of leaves, tossing them into the air like confetti. Mark, ever the responsible one, was trying to catch them before they hit the ground, muttering something about scientific research. A soft chuckle escaped Melissa's lips. "They're happy," Kenneth noted beside her, his voice quieter than usual. Melissa glanced up at him. He looked different out here, less polished, more at ease. His tie was gone, the top button of his shirt undone, sleeves rolled to his forearms. He looked comfortable. "They deserve to be," she murmured. A short silence stretched between them, not awkward, but full, as if both of them were waiting for the right words to fill the space. Melissa inhaled deeply. "I never expected this," she admitted. Kenneth's brow lifted slightly. "This," Melissa gestured vaguely between them. "You, Mr. Any of this." Kenneth was quiet for a beat before he said, "Neither did I." The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. Melissa stopped walking. For weeks, she had been ignoring this feeling, the small, subtle way he had found space in her life, the coffee, the meals, the quiet understanding he had offered without asking for anything in return. And last night, his confession. She hadn't been able to stop thinking about it, how simple and steady his words had been. "I want to be part of your life." Not, "I want you." Not, "I want something from you." Just, "I want to be part of it." Melissa swallowed. "I'm still scared," she admitted. "I don't want my kids to get attached to something that won't last." Kenneth exhaled slowly. He didn't look frustrated or disappointed, just patient. "I get it," he said, "and I won't rush you." She glanced at him, searching for any sign of hesitation, but he just held her gaze, steady and unwavering, like he had already made up his mind. Melissa's chest tightened, because the truth was, she wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that for once, she wasn't walking this path alone, and maybe, for the first time in years, she could let herself try. Mark's voice suddenly cut through her thoughts. "Hey, Prince!" Kenneth blinked. "Excuse me?" Mark jogged up, hands on his hips. You still haven't answered my question. Kenneth smirked. Which one? Mark squinted at him. Did you sew your wallet into your pants yet? Melissa groaned. Kenneth let out a full laugh. Not yet, he admitted, but I'll take your advice into consideration. Amy ran up beside her brother, grabbing Kenneth's hand without hesitation. We should get ice cream, she announced. Kenneth didn't even flinch at the small, sticky hand in his. Instead, he nodded. That sounds like an excellent idea. Mark grinned. I like this guy. Melissa shook her head, exasperated. Mark shrugged. What? He listens to me. Kenneth shot Melissa a triumphant look. Melissa exhaled sharply, but there was no real frustration behind it. Just something warm, something new. Amy tugged on Kenneth's sleeve. If you like Mommy, you should marry her. Melissa nearly choked. Kenneth, however, just smiled. We'll take it one step at a time, he said smoothly. Mark squinted. So you do like her? Kenneth's eyes flickered to Melissa. For a second. Just a second. Her breath caught. Kenneth held her gaze. Then, with an easy smirk, he answered, Yeah, I do. Melissa didn't look away this time. She just smiled. For once, she let herself believe. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. And if you enjoyed this story, please share it with your friends on WhatsApp. And now, share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.